It was a hot and humid afternoon, typical of the Amazon, when my group of researchers and I embarked on an expedition to study the region's biodiversity. We had heard stories about an unexplored area where the forest seemed to close in on itself, creating a labyrinth of gigantic trees and winding rivers. The idea was to spend 2 weeks collecting samples and documenting wildlife. Little did we know that this would be a one-way trip for some of us. On the third day, we began to notice strange things. The sounds of the forest, which had once been a constant buzz of life, seemed to have vanished. The silence was oppressive, as if nature itself were watching us. Our equipment began to fail inexplicably. Compasses spun endlessly, radios emitted only static, and the GPS devices simply stopped working. It was then that we found the footprints. Large, deep, and with claw marks that did not match any known animal in the region. At night, fear settled in. We heard noises around the camp, as if something were moving between the trees. No one slept well. In the morning, we discovered that one of our tents had been destroyed, and the colleague who was inside had vanished. There were no signs of a struggle, just a trail of blood leading into the forest. We decided to follow the trail, but soon realized we were being led to something much worse. What happened next was a nightmare. We found a clearing where the ground was covered with bones and animal remains. In the center stood an ancient structure made of moss-covered stones which seemed to emit a malignant energy. It was then that we saw it. A tall creature with scaly skin and eyes that glowed like embers. It moved too quickly to be real. And before we could react, another member of the group was dragged into the shadows. We ran, but the forest seemed to move against us. Trees twisted, blocking our path, and the air grew heavy, as though we were being suffocated. When we finally managed to escape that area, there were only 3 of us left. The rest of the group had disappeared, and I knew I would never see them again. After the disappearance of yet another group member, panic took hold of us. What remained of our group, now reduced to 3 people, decided to abandon the expedition and return to civilization. But the forest seemed to have other plans. The trails we had carefully marked were covered by dense vegetation, as if the Amazon was trying to prevent us from leaving. The sky, once clear, was now shrouded in thick fog that obscured our vision. We walked for hours, but it seemed that we were going in circles. With every turn, I hoped to see something familiar, but only found more trees and shadows that seemed to move on their own. Then we heard a sound that made us stop dead in our tracks. A low, guttural moan coming from somewhere ahead. It was human but distorted, as if the person were in agony. We decided to investigate, driven by a mix of fear and hope of finding our missing colleague. What we found still haunts me. In a clearing, there was a figure crouched down, facing away from us. Its movements were strange, as if it were chewing on something. When it turned around, I saw the face of one of the missing group members, but something was terribly wrong. Its eyes were completely black, and its mouth was covered in blood. It looked at us with a vacant expression, as if it did not recognize us, and then let out a scream that echoed through the forest. We ran again, but the creature pursued us with supernatural speed. Then we found a river. Without thinking twice, we jumped into the cold water and swam to the other shore. When we looked back, the creature was standing at the riverbank as if it could not cross. Its eyes stared at us for a moment before it vanished into the forest. We thought we were safe, but soon realized the river had taken us to an even stranger, our place. The vegetation was denser and the air felt charged with an oppressive energy. It was then that we found an abandoned cabin made of rotting wood and covered in moss. We decided to spend the night there since the sun was setting and we had no strength to continue. Inside the cabin, we found old journals and yellowed maps. The pages were filled with accounts from others who had gotten lost in the forest. Speaking of creatures and inexplicable phenomena, one entry in particular caught my attention. The forest is alive. It watches us. It tests us. Those who fail become part of it. That night, we heard voices whispering outside the cabin. They were human voices but distorted, as if they were speaking backward. No one slept. We stayed awake, armed with knives and flashlights, hoping the dawn would bring us some hope. Dawn brought a momentary relief, but we soon realized we were more lost than ever. The cabin, which had seemed like a refuge, now felt like a trap. The voices we heard during the night had vanished, but the silence that replaced them was even more disturbing. We decided to move on, but the forest seemed to close in around us, as if guiding us to a specific destination. After hours of walking, we reached a clearing where the ground was covered with a black, sticky substance. In the center stood a gigantic tree, unlike any I'd ever seen. Its roots stretched out like tentacles, and its trunk was covered in ancient symbols that seemed to pulse with a faint light. It was then that we realized we were not alone. Humanoid figures emerged from the shadows, moving in a disjointed manner, as if they were puppets controlled by invisible strings. Their eyes shone with the same light as the symbols on the tree, and their mouths opened in silent screams. They slowly approached, surrounding us. One of my companions tried to run, but he was pulled to the ground by the roots of the tree, which moved as if they were alive. The last member of the group and I stepped back, but soon realized there was nowhere to escape. It was then that I heard a voice in my mind, soft and persuasive, saying, "Do you want to live? Then make a choice." I looked at my companion and saw the same terror in his eyes. Before we could react, he was pulled into the tree, which seemed to swallow him as if it were made of liquid. The voice returned, more insistent this time. "The forest demands a sacrifice. Choose wisely." I knew what this meant. The forest wanted me to give something in exchange for my life. Without thinking twice, I grabbed a knife and cut a piece of my arm, offering it to the roots of the tree. The pain was excruciating, but I immediately felt a sense of relief, as if the forest had accepted my offering. The humanoid figures retreated, and the tree began to withdraw, as if it were closing in. The clearing fell silent again, and I knew I'd been spared. I walked for hours until I finally found a path that led me back to civilization. When I arrived at the first village, people looked at me with suspicion, as if they knew I had brought something back from the forest with me. Today, years later, I still carry the scars of that experience, both physical and mental. The Amazon rainforest holds secrets that humanity is not prepared to understand. And I know that somewhere in there, the tree is still waiting, ready to claim more victims. When I finally reached the nearest village, I was exhausted, hurt, and traumatized. The villagers looked at me with a mix of curiosity and fear, as if they knew I'd brought something back from the forest with me. An older man, who seemed to be the leader of the community, approached me and asked what had happened. I tried to explain, but the words seemed insufficient to describe the horror I had experienced. He took me to his home, where his wife tended to my wounds. As she applied herbs and bandages, the man told me stories about the forest. He spoke of an ancient legend that said the Amazon was guarded by ancestral spirits who protected the land from intruders. Those who disrespected the forest were punished, and many never returned. He looked me in the eyes and said, "You were chosen to return, but the forest will never let you go completely." That phrase echoed in my mind as I tried to recover. Days passed, and I began to notice strange things. At night, I heard whispers coming from the forest, as if the voices I'd heard before were calling me back. Vivid and disturbing dreams haunted me, showing images of the gigantic tree and the creatures that had pursued me. I would wake up sweating, feeling as if something was watching me. I decided I needed to leave as soon as possible, but the forest seemed unwilling to let me go. When I tried to take a boat to the nearest city, a sudden storm arose, forcing the boatman to cancel the trip. I tried to go by land, but the roads were blocked by fallen trees and floods. It was as if nature itself was preventing me from leaving. It was then that I realized the forest had marked me. The scar on my arm, where I had made the sacrifice, began to hurt constantly, and I felt a constant presence around me. The people in the village started to avoid me, as if they knew I was carrying something evil. So the older man told me I needed to make an offering to calm the spirits, but I didn't know what else I could give. One night, while I was trying to sleep, I heard a noise coming from outside the house. When I looked out the window, I saw a tall, dark figure with eyes that glowed like embers. It was the same creature I'd seen in the forest. It stared at me for a moment before disappearing into the darkness. The next morning, I found out that the older man had disappeared. No one knew where he had gone, but I knew the forest had claimed another victim. I decided I couldn't stay there any longer. I took what little I had and began to walk, ignoring the warnings of the villagers. I walked for days until I finally reached a larger city. There I received medical and psychological help, but nothing seemed to alleviate the weight I carried. The forest had changed me, and I knew I would never be the same. Even far from the Amazon, the forest continued to haunt me. I returned home, but the feeling that something was wrong never left me. The scar on my arm hurt constantly, and I began to see things that shouldn't be there. Shadows moving in the corners of my vision, whispers echoing in the silence of the night. It was as if the forest had left a part of itself inside me. I tried to resume my life, but it was impossible to ignore what had happened. I decided to write about my experience, hoping that by putting everything on paper, I could find some relief. But every word I wrote seemed to bring back vivid and painful memories. The people around me began to notice my change in behavior. I was distant, paranoid, always looking over my shoulder as if I was being followed. One night, while I was working on my account, I heard a noise coming from my backyard. When I looked out the window, I saw a tall, dark figure with eyes that glowed like embers. It was the same creature I'd seen in the forest. It stared at me for a moment before disappearing into the darkness. The next morning, I discovered that my dog was missing. No one knew where he had gone, but I knew the forest had claimed another victim. I decided that I needed to confront what was happening. I returned to the Amazon, this time alone. I knew it was a dangerous decision, but I felt I had no choice. The forest was calling me, and I knew I had to respond. When I arrived at the village where I'd been helped before, the residents looked at me with fear and sadness. The old man had disappeared, and they knew I was involved. I walked to the clearing where I'd found the gigantic tree. This time, the forest seemed to guide me, as if it knew I was coming back. When I reached the clearing, the tree was there, larger and more imposing than I remembered. The roots moved like tentacles, and the symbols on the trunk glowed with an intense light. The voice in my mind returned, soft and persuasive. "You have come back. The forest is pleased." It was then that I understood the true meaning of sacrifice. The forest did not just want my flesh and blood, it wanted my soul. I had been marked, and now I was part of it. The humanoid figures emerged from the shadows, moving toward me. This time, I felt no fear. I knew there was no escape. Today, years later, I'm still here, trapped in the forest that haunted me so much. I write this account in the hope that someone will find it and understand the danger that the Amazon hides. The forest is alive, and it does not forgive those who disturb it. If you're reading this, know that not everything in nature is benign. Some secrets are better left untouched. This is the end of my account. The forest called me, and I answered. Now I am part of it, just like all those who came before me. May my story serve as a warning to those who dare to challenge the limits of the unknown. The Amazon holds mysteries that humanity is not prepared to understand, and I am just another victim of its wrath.